Hi, this is Lee from the Law School Toolbox and the Bar Exam Toolbox. Welcome back to the Listen and Learn series. Today we're discussing wills and estates, and specifically the different methods for dividing assets amongst descendants in multiple generations of descent. The three methods are 1. Per Stirpes, 2. Modern per Stirpes, which is also sometimes called per capita by representation, and 3. Per capita by generation. After briefly orienting ourselves about when these issues come up, we will discuss the rules of distribution for each method, and we will use simple examples to illustrate how these rules apply. Then we will use variations of a final example to review the methods, their similarities, and their differences. Now, for a brief orientation of when we will need to use these methods of distribution. As you likely know, when a decedent dies intestate, meaning the decedent did not leave a will indicating how their property should be divided, the decedent's property is divided according to the intestacy laws of that state. Additionally, even if the decedent leaves a will that provides for distribution of some property not distributed via the will is divided according to intestacy laws. Most states' intestacy laws leave at least part of the property to a surviving spouse and the rest to the decedent's issue, meaning children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on. When property is passed to the decedent's issue via intestacy laws, we call the issue heirs. Sometimes the division of assets amongst heirs is simple and would be the same under any method of distribution. For example, if the decedent leaves 3 surviving children, the property is simply divided equally among the 3 children. But what if the decedent has 3 children, A, B, and C? At the time of decedent's death, B is alive, but A and C are deceased. A has 1 child, F, and C has 2 children, D and E. In this case, how do we divide the property among B and the 3 living grandchildren, F, D, and E? Well, the answer depends on what method of distribution the state applies. So let's jump into those methods, starting with the most antiquated and moving to the method that is most commonly used today. The most antiquated method of dividing property among multiple generations of heirs is the traditional per Stirpes method. Per Stirpes literally means by roots or by stalks. This method gives each branch of the family an equal share of an estate. By branch of the family, we mean each child in the first generation of heirs who is either living at the time of the decedent's death or who has living issue. Let's apply this method to our hypothetical above with A, B, and C. Remember, at the time of decedent's death, B is alive, but C and A are deceased. A's child F and C's 2 children D and E are all living. Step 1 for per Stirpes distribution. Determine the number of living children and deceased children with issue in the first generation of heirs. Here, there are 3. B is a living child and A and C are deceased children with issue. Step 2, divide the assets into equal shares for each living child or deceased child with issue in the first generation of heirs. So here we would divide the assets into 3 equal shares, 1 for A, 1 for B, and 1 for C. Step 3, divide a deceased child's share among that child's issue. Here, since A is deceased, A's issue F would receive A's 1/3 share. And since C is deceased, C's 1/3 share will be equally divided among C's issue, D and E, who would each receive a 1/6 share. Now that we have a basic understanding of the steps for per Stirpes division, let's change our hypo a bit to illustrate how this can yield even more unequal distribution among the grandchildren. In this example, imagine that A, B, and C all predeceased the decedent. A has 1 living issue, F. B has 3 living issue, GHI. C has 2 living issue, D and E. How do we distribute the property? Start with step 1. Determine the number of living children and deceased children with issue in the first generation of heirs. Here there are still 3 children in the first generation because there are 3 deceased children with issue. Step 2. divide the assets into equal shares for each living child or deceased child with issue in the first generation. Here we would divide the assets into 3 equal shares, one for A, one for B, and one for C. Step 3, divide a deceased child's share equally among that child's issue. This is where things get less equal. A has one issue F, so F would receive A's 1/3 share. B, on the other hand, has 3 issue, G, H, and I. G, H, and I will equally share B's 1/3 share, meaning each receives 1/9. And just like above, C's 2 children, D and E, would equally share C's 1/3 share, receiving 1/6 each. So even though everyone in the first generation of heirs predeceased the decedent, the 6 living grandchildren do not take equal shares. Their shares are based on their parents' share and divided equally among siblings. One final note on per Stirpes before we move on to the more common and less antiquated methods of division. For any method of division, we are only concerned with living heirs or deceased heirs with living issue. If an heir is deceased and has no living issue, that heir goes away. This makes sense because if the heir is deceased and there is no one to take the heir's share, we literally cannot distribute the share. So let's quickly look at how this works in practice. Imagine in our last hypo that A, B, and C are still the first generation and all still predeceased the decedent. A still has 1 living issue and C still has 2 living issue. But in this hypothetical, B has no living issue. In this case, B is not included in our count of heirs in step 1. Remember, step 1 is to determine the number of living children and deceased children with living issue in the first generation of heirs. In this case, that number is 2 because B is not living and B does not have living issue. Next, we will divide the assets among the living children and deceased children with living issue in the first generation of heirs, 1/2 to A and 1/2 to C. Step 3, divide a deceased child's share equally among that child's issue. A's issue F would receive A's 1/2 share, and each of C's 2 living issue, D and E, would receive 1/4. Whew, that gets us through the antiquated methods of per Stirpes distribution. Now we jump to the other end of the spectrum and discuss the modern method that most states use today. This method is called per capita by generation. Remember how with per Stirpes distribution, our grandchildren received unequal shares? Per capita by generation avoids this inequity by combining leftover assets and dividing the recombined assets equally at each generation. Let's use an example to illustrate the steps for per capita by generation distribution. Let's again imagine that the decedent has 3 children, A, B, and C. This time, at the time of decedent's death, A is deceased with 1 living child, F. B is alive, and C is deceased with 2 living children, D and E. Our distribution steps start the same as per Stirpes distribution. Step 1, determine the number of living heirs and deceased heirs with living issue in the generation closest to the decedent. Here, there are 3. A and C are deceased with living issue, and B is alive at the time of the decedent's death. Step 2, divide the assets among the living heirs and deceased heirs with living issue in the generation closest to the decedent and distribute that share to any living heirs in that generation. Here we would divide the assets into 1/3 for A, 1/3 for B, and 1/3 for C, and distribute B's 1/3 share to B. Step 3, this is where things change from the per Stirpes approach. Instead of giving A's issue A's entire 1/3 and dividing C's 1/3 equally among C's 2 issue, we are going to recombine A's 1/3 with C's 1/3 and then divide that total equally among A's and C's issue. So A's and C's combined 2/3 share would be equally distributed to F, D, and E. Now that we have covered both ends of the spectrum, the antiquated per Stirpes and the modern per capita by generation approach, let's look at the middle ground. This method is called either modern per Stirpes or per capita with representation. The good news is that this method is just like per Stirpes with one major difference. The root for per Stirpes distribution starts at the first generation with living heirs. Let's use our second per Stirpes example to illustrate this difference. Remember, in this example, the decedent has 3 children, A, B, and C. But let's imagine that A, B, and C all predeceased the decedent. A has 1 living issue, F. B has 3 living issue, G, H, and I. C still has 2 living issue, D and E. How do we distribute the property under the modern per Stirpes or per capita by representation approach? Start with step 1. Determine the first generation with living heirs. Here, there are no living heirs in the generation closest to the decedent because A, B, and C are all deceased. So the first generation with living heirs is the generation of grandchildren, F, G, H, I, D, and E. Step 2, divide the assets into equal shares for each living heir or deceased heir with issue in the first generation of heirs in which any are living. Here we would divide the assets into 6 equal shares, 1 for each of the 6 grandchildren. Since all 6 grandchildren are alive in this hypothetical, that would be the end of our analysis. But what if A's child F and C's child D were both also deceased? In this variation, imagine that F has 1 living child, J, and D has 2 living children, K and L. In this case, steps 1 and 2 above would be exactly the same. 1, determine the first generation with living heirs. Here, that is the generation with the 6 grandchildren, because even though F and D are deceased, G, H, I, and E are all living. Step 2, divide the assets into equal shares for each living heir or deceased heir with issue in the first generation of heirs in which any are living. Again, we would divide this into 1/6 shares, 1 for each of the 6 grandchildren. G, H, I, and E would each receive their 1/6 share. From here, modern per Stirpes or per capita with representation works exactly like traditional per Stirpes. So we apply our per Stirpes step 3. Divide a deceased heir's share equally among that heir's issue. So here, F's issue J would receive F's 1/6 share, and D's 2 issue K and L would share D's 1/6 share, each receiving 1/12. In other words, after the first generation with living heirs, modern per Stirpes works exactly like per Stirpes. How would this example be different under the most modern approach, per capita by generation? Well, let's start with step 1 for that approach. Step 1, determine the number of living heirs and deceased heirs with living issue in the generation closest to the decedent. Here, there were 3 deceased heirs with issue in the generation closest to the decedent, A, B, and C. Step 2, divide the assets amongst the living heirs and deceased heirs with living issue in the generation closest to the decedent and distribute that share to any living heirs in that generation. Here we would not need to distribute any shares to the first generation because they are all deceased. Notice, when applying either per capita by generation or modern per Stirpes per capita by representation, you essentially just skip to the first generation with any living heirs. Since we cannot distribute any assets to any living heirs in the first generation, let's move on to the next generation and step 3. Step 3. We recombine all the assets. Here, we still have all the assets because none of the 1/3 shares were distributed, and divide them equally among living heirs and deceased heirs with issue in the next generation. Then we distribute to any living heirs in this generation. Here, we would divide the assets equally among the 6 grandchildren, F, G, H, I, D, and E, and distribute the 1/6 shares to G, H, I, and E. But we still have F and D's 2/6, or 1/3 share to distribute. So we have to repeat step 3, recombine all the remaining assets and distribute them equally among living heirs in the next generation. Here, F and D's combined shares are 2/6 or 1/3 simplified. And there are 3 living heirs in the next generation, F's issue J and D's 2 issue K and L. Under the per capita by generation approach, J, K, and L would all receive equal parts of the 1/3. Mathematically, this means that J, K, and L each receive 1/9. One side note here, do not panic if you went to law school because you were promised that there would be no math. The bar examiners and your law school professors do not expect you to do complicated fraction multiplication and division on the bar exam and your law school exams. As long as you accurately describe how things are being divided, you will be fine. So here you could leave this with J, K, and L each receiving an equal part of the 1/3 combined share. If you know that it's 1/9, great. But if not, don't sweat it. The graders want to see that you know how to apply these doctrines, not that you remember 5th grade math. Okay, side note over. Now that we have made it through all 3 methods, let's review the methods using variations of the same example. Let's start with the simplest case. Remember, decedent has 3 children, A, B, and C. A has 1 child, F, B has 3 children, G, H, and I, and C has 2 children, D and E. First variation, A, B, and C are all living at the time of decedent's death. This one is simple, right? A, B, and C each take 1/3 under any method. Now let's move to our second scenario. What if C is deceased at the time of decedent's death? Again, the answer is the same under any method. A and B each take 1/3, and C's 2 children, D and E, each take 1/6. The answer is the same because only 1 heir in the first generation is deceased. The methods only yield different results when more than 1 heir in the first generation is deceased. For our third variation, let's examine what if B and C are both deceased at the time of decedent's death. Now, the different methods will yield different results. Under per Stirpes, we divide the assets into 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3 for A, B, and C. Then B's 3 issue will take equal shares of B's 1/3. So G, H, and I each will receive 1/9. And C's 2 issue will each take equal shares of C's 1/3. So D and E each receive 1/6 share. The result would be the same under modern per Stirpes because that only differs from per Stirpes if entire generations are deceased at the time of death. But how would this be different under per capita by generation? For our final scenario, under per capita by generation, we would recombine B and C's 1/3 shares to get 2/3. Then we would equally divide the 2/3 share amongst the 5 issue in the next generation. So G, H, I, D, and E would all take equal parts of the 2/3. Now let's look at a variation in which per Stirpes and modern per Stirpes would yield different results. Imagine that A and B and C are all deceased at the time of decedent's death. Under per Stirpes, we would still divide the assets into 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 for A, B, and C. A's issue would receive A's 1/3 share. B's 3 issue would each receive equal shares of B's 1/3, 1/9 each. And C's 2 issue would split C's 1/3, receiving 1/6 each. However, under modern per Stirpes, we would skip the first generation of heirs because there is no living heir in that generation. So we would start the division at the second generation, and each of the 6 grandchildren would receive a 1/6 share. In this variation, modern per Stirpes, per capita by representation, reaches the same result as per capita by generation. Under per capita by generation, we equally divide all remaining shares at each generation. Here, all 3 1/3 shares are remaining after the first generation because the entire first generation is deceased. So we recombine the 3 1/3 into the entire estate and divide that equally among the next generation, the 6 grandchildren. Whoa. Okay. We have one more variation to double check our understanding of something we briefly discussed earlier. Let's consider a final case where the decedent has 3 children, A, B, and C. At the time of decedent's death, A, B, and C are living and C is deceased. In this example, C has no issue. How do we divide the assets under each method? This is another fairly simple example. And the result is the same regardless of what method we apply. Remember, because C is deceased without issue, C goes away because we do not have anyone to whom to distribute C's share. In this case, A and B are each entitled to 1/2 shares of the assets. Well, that wraps up our discussion of the 3 most common methods of dividing assets amongst heirs, per Stirpes, modern per Stirpes, or per capita by representation, and per capita by generation. We covered a lot of ground today. Hopefully you found these examples helpful as you continue to study these methods for your exams. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes.